If a block of ice the size of a mountain is moving towards you, what should you do? Well, if it were me, I would get out of the way. These moving mountains of ice do exist, and we call them glaciers. They tend to move very slowly, often only a few centimeters per day, so it would be a rare occasion for a human to get struck by a glacier. This is not true, however, for the landscape that lies in the path of a moving glacier. Land and rock cannot move out of the path of a glacier, so they are subjected to glacial erosion, which is simply the carving and shaping of the land beneath a moving glacier. Glacial erosion and the interesting landforms that result from this process are the subjects of this lesson. There are two main processes of glacial erosion. The first that we will talk about is plucking, which is defined as the erosion and transport of large chunks of rocks. As a glacier moves over the landscape, water melts below the glacier and seeps into cracks within the underlying bedrock. This water freezes and melts, weakening the bonds holding pieces of bedrock in place. These pieces of rock can now be picked up or plucked from their rocky base and carried along with the moving glacier. If you ever put an ice cube on your finger and felt the skin of your finger stick to the ice cube, then you have a fairly good idea of how plucking works. Plucking removes rocks and by itself creates changes in the landscape, but plucking also contributes to the second process of glacial erosion, known as abrasion. Abrasion is defined as the erosion that occurs when particles scrape against each other. The enormous weight of the glacier, along with the rocks and sediment plucked up and clinging to its belly, scratch and carve the rock surface below. It's almost as if the moving glacier is sanding the rocks with abrasive sandpaper. As the glacier sands the rock, it leaves behind long scratches that form in the direction of the glacial movement, called glacial striations. Seeing these scratch marks is a sure sign that a glacier once covered the land. The scraping and plucking of glacial erosion creates a number of distinct landforms and features. If the glacier erodes into a mountain, it can create a cirque, which is a round hollow with steep sides. It is as if the glacier scoops out the side of the mountain like an ice cream scooper. If you look at a cirque, you might think it resembles an amphitheater. In fact, with a bit of imagination, you can imagine circus animals and clowns putting on a circus at the base of a cirque. When the glacier melts and moves on, it often leaves behind water that gets trapped in the cirque. A small mountain lake of trapped water is called a tarn. It might help you remember this term if you think of the two T's, tarn and trapped. When we look at cirques and tarns, our eyes are drawn to the bowl-like inner structures that were carved out. But the peaks left behind from glacial erosion are just as impressive. If a mountain is eroded by several glaciers, we see the formation of a glacial horn, which is a good name because it looks like a horn jutting up from the earth. A glacial horn is defined as a sharp, angular peak formed when several glaciers erode a mountain in different directions. It's almost as if the glaciers sharpen the mountain into a point, just like ancient civilizations sharpened rocks into spears. The Matterhorn in Switzerland is a perfect example of a glacial horn. In a somewhat similar fashion, if two glaciers slide down opposite sides of a mountain, we end up with a sharp, narrow mountain ridge called an arete. If you're an adventurous hiker, you would find walking along the ridge of an arete exhilarating, as it would provide a high-altitude scenic view. In fact, you would likely give an arete an A rating. We mentioned earlier that as ice moves over bedrock, it can smooth the rock, cut striations into the rock, and also pluck rocks from the foundation. The erosion can lead to the formation of a roche-moutonné, which is a mass of rock carved by a passing glacier. The rock formation is distinctive because it has a smooth, rounded side, where the ice abrasively slid over it, followed by a steep, ragged side, where rocks were plucked from the surface. These formations can be small, with some measuring only 1 meter in height, and we see that the term roche-moutonné means sheep back in French. Perhaps the person who coined the name thought that the rock structures looked like the backs of sheep grazing in a field. Knowing this might help you recall the term. But I think if you say the term Roche Montagne fast enough, it sounds a bit like Rock Mountain, and this might be the best memory jogger. Let's review. Glaciers can be thought of as moving mountains of ice. As they move over the landscape, they cause glacial erosion, which is defined as the carving and shaping of the land beneath a moving glacier. There are two main processes of glacial erosion. Plucking is the erosion and transport of large chunks of rocks that stick to and get picked up by the glacier. Abrasion is the erosion that occurs when particles scrape against each other. It works in a similar fashion to sandpaper. There are a number of features and landforms that result from glacial erosion. Glacial striations are long scratches that form in the direction of glacial movement. A cirque is a round hollow with steep sides that resembles an amphitheater. Maybe one that could hold a circus. If a cirque traps water, it can result in a small mountain lake of trapped water called a tarn. A glacial horn is conveniently named because it looks like a horn jutting up from the earth. It is actually a sharp angular peak formed when several glaciers erode a mountain in different directions. If two glaciers erode opposite sides of a mountain, we end up with a sharp, narrow mountain ridge called an A-rate, which provides an A rating when it comes to scenic views. Glacial erosion can also create a roche montagne, which is a mass of rocks carved by a passing glacier. The rock formation has a smooth, rounded side caused by abrasion and a steep, ragged side where rocks were plucked from the surface.